Welcome to the Tribal Data Toolbox Exercise 10, Importing PM2.5 Weighing Lab Data. So this is the data that you get usually in the form of an email, hopefully in a spreadsheet attached to an email sent to you from the weighing lab. And grills make a lot of PM, so I hope you're not hungry while you watch this, because you need to get something to make sure your blood sugar is up. This isn't an easy exercise, but it's not as long as some of the others. So here is our Tribal Data Toolbox, and we are going to be working through this exercise 10. So what we've done now is we're in filter method monitoring, and so we're working through these brown buttons from top to bottom. In the last exercise, we imported the raw data file from the sampler, and now we're ready to import the data from the weighing lab. So let's take a close look at the exercise description again. So we've got data from two samplers that were co-located, and the exercise description tells us about the units and gives us some hints. So we're going to first of all take a look at the data itself, which is this lovely thing, and this is the file that we get from the laboratory. And you can see, as typical with a lot of text files, we have a long first row because that's all the headers, and then we've got rows of data. So remembering that we have to import data always in the same way into the toolbox in a folder called Tribal Data Toolbox _version 2.1, that's in your C drive, and you save this data as a file in that folder. And you have to make sure that there are headers, that you've got enough headers for the number of columns, that the data are comma delimited, so commas separate every what will be a field, and then it goes to the next column. And you can see here we've got filter number, we've got these filter numbers memorized, the type, field, blank, routine, co-located, and then we also want to make sure that we don't have any straight zeros or straight ones or straight integers for any values in the first row for which we have non-integers following. And looking through here quickly, we know that we don't. So we're going to save this in the place on our in the folder Tribal Data Toolbox on the C drive. So I'll pull this out here a little bit. On the C drive, we have a folder, Tribal Data Toolbox, and we're going to save it as a file called new import.txt, and I'm just going to write over my old file that I have there, because this is all this is the entryway into the pipeline of the Tribal Data Toolbox. So I'm going to say save, and I've already saved that file. And I always keep my raw data. So we can leave this open just in case we have to check on it. So it says using the SOP for PM filter data. Okay, let's make sure that we consult that. And you can see we've done all of this importing raw data from the sampler, and now we're down here importing data from the weighing lab. So I'm going to click Control-click to go here, and now it goes through, first of all, the new import.txt file creation, which we just did, and then goes through the process as we're going to continue to follow this. So I'm going to pull this over here where I can have it open and then start the process. So import data from the weighing lab. Alright, it opens up this form, and the first step is going to be the same as you've done before, and it says this will only work if it's a comma delimited text file with field names. Okay, it is. Import successful. Hooray! Now let's take a look at it and make sure that it's really there. And we see we have 12 records, because this includes the field blanks, because of course those were weighed to see if somehow any PM got on the filters during the process of shipping and handling them. So we've got 12 filters, and all this data came from the lab, all this information about the conditioning environment, the weighing environment, and we used as our template for the toolbox the TAMS laboratory weighing lab standard spreadsheet report. So when you are importing data from your weighing lab, if it's not the TAMS lab, you may have columns in different orders, and we'd be happy to help you with that one-on-one. So this looks good. It made it into the toolbox. Now we have to do the scariest part, which is set up the transfer to the data verification table. So this is where we map the files map the columns from the data import table into the columns in the middle table in the toolbox, which is the verification table. So we're going to click this button and it opens up this scary blank query design grid. So as we've done before, we are going to pull all of these down into the grid. So remember, these are the headers from the table data import, which is just the headers in your file from the weighing laboratory, and then you're mapping them into what headers there are in the verification table that match. So we clicked on the first one, sample ID, and we know that's filter ID. I'm going to pull this grabber bar down. I'm going to hold down my shift key and click on the last one, just like anything else in Windows that selects all of them. And then I'm going to pull them down. You can click anywhere in the selected orange area. Hold your cursor down and click and pull the whole set down, and then release your cursor, mouse click, and then they get mapped into what the toolbox thinks they should be. And we have to very carefully check. Like I said, we designed the toolbox using the TAMS weighing laboratory standard Excel report as a template. So yours from your weighing laboratory might be a little bit different, and even in this case there are two that the toolbox can't guess. So we see right here, now in order to see the whole field we can hover just like in Excel until you get that right and left pointing black arrow, and then hold your clicker down and pull it over to the right so you can see the whole field. And that's the tare conditioning environment. So before it was weighed even the first time, it was conditioned, so the piece of filter paper sat in an environment that had a standard deviation of the humidity over 24 hours be something, and amazingly that has to be tracked in order to verify that you have used a laboratory that follows the correct procedures for weighing PM2.5 filters. So now we tell the toolbox, okay, what's the column it should go into in the toolbox? So you click this down arrow and we have to select a field here for it to go into. So we see that these are all the different fields, and we can't pick the same one that's already been picked. That would be like putting both of your legs into the same trouser pant. We don't want to do that. We are looking for tare conditioning 24-hour standard deviation humidity. Tare conditioning 24-hour standard deviation humidity. Here we go. And then there's one more that the toolbox doesn't guess, and that is this one, gross conditioning environment 24-hour standard deviation humidity. And we look for gross conditioning 24-hour standard deviation humidity. And here we are, gross conditioning 24-hour standard deviation humidity. And we need to go through and check all of these carefully, and unfortunately the only way to do that is to look at them carefully, gross, weigh, session, gross, weigh, session, etc., and check every single one of these. Now keep in mind that once you've done this in your data, you won't have to do it again. The toolbox will remember. So we will click Save, and then the lower X to get out of the Query Design window. And now we are ready. We've set up the transfer to the data verification table. Now we're ready to do the transfer. Yes, we want to end 12 rows. That's good. So now the next step is to check the filter IDs against the chain of custody. And what this does is this step F, checking filter IDs against the chain of custody, looks at the chain of custody records and makes sure that in this file that you've got from the laboratory, you've already entered chain of custody records, so the toolbox knows what sampler it was in, the dates, etc. So if you click this and you get this nice box, it means every filter that you just imported from the lab has chain of custody record already for it. So okay, that's good. Now let's just look at the data verification table. So now we've put each column from the lab data into the verification table, and we see we've got all the files here, 12 records. That's good. So we're going to continue on. Now we need to tell the toolbox what this is. This is PM2.5 data. We know from the exercise description that we're dealing with milligrams, and the temperatures in the lab that are listed are in Celsius. So we're going to click that button and say yes, we want to attach every row, and we want to give units. And now we continue on with the next step. To make sure that the data matches the chain of custody data, we're going to check the filter types and the tare weight dates against the chain of custody. And it says every filter type and every tare weight date in your import match the values in chain of custody. Woohoo! Now in the SOP, there are instructions for what you should do when this doesn't happen. So the next step, J, missing filter run data. So we're just importing the data from the lab now. What this does is it checks to make sure you've already got the data off of the sampler into the toolbox. Okay, it already has filter run data in the toolbox for all these filter IDs. So now calculate and update air concentrations, and it calculates the concentration, so the mass on the filter divided by the volume of air, and makes sure, and if you have that information in the toolbox, it checks that already. And now we continue to import and qualify filter data. So now this is where we can look at ranges, and let's just say we were interested in anything that was between 0 and, let's just say we want to make sure there's nothing over 15, let's just say 10. And you click this button, display data outside of this concentration range, and it shows us, yep, we had a few values greater than 10, not too much. We're going to flag those just because I want to find them more easily later. And it says update 4 rows, yes. And now if we click on that again, we can see that it added qualifiers of R, meaning range. So when we look at the data in the archive table, we could find these data easily. If, for example, we were just suspicious or wanted to make sure we could find them, that these are flagged with an R, meaning it's outside this range here that we specified. So now these are the checks that also have to be done, and if you are doing this in Excel, you could set up a column to do this calculation, but the toolbox does it. So displaying filter IDs where the filter was weighed more than 30 days after the sampling period, because that's a no-no. So we click this, every filter was weighed within 30 days. Good. And if not, you could click these buttons here and they would add unique flags. Miscalculated net weight. Did is the weight that is calculated in terms of the gross minus the tare weight. Is that correct as far as Access thinks? Yes, it was calculated correctly, and now displaying out of range relative percent difference between the routine samplers filter and the collocated samplers filter. So we click this, we see 1. So what do we have here? Well, this is for site ID 2, the filter ID ending in 14. The routine air concentration was 5 micrograms per cubic meter, but in the collocated with the filter ID ending in 15, the concentration was 6.63 about micrograms per cubic meter. And because these are very low values, even the difference of about 1.6 divided by their average is greater than 10%. So this might be okay, but we definitely want to flag it. So I'm going to click the lower X, and now I'm going to say qualify data, and it's going to say 1 row, yes. 2, because it's flagging both of them. So I'm going to click this to look at it again now, and you could see the percent difference is 27, so that is way too high of a difference between them. And so now that we've got that flagged, we'll be able to find it more easily later. Now in this next step, you could say, for example, you had a filter ID. This needs to populate with filter IDs. You had a filter ID that you knew there was something wonky about it, or you just were uncertain, perhaps something on the chain of custody. You could enter a filter ID here, and then you could click here for displaying the data for that filter ID, and you could flag the lab data from that filter ID if you had such a filter ID that you knew something was weird with. If you don't, then you can continue on. Now let's inspect the data verification table. So good, this is just the data from the lab, and it's all here. And let's look and make sure, here are our flags. So here is the AX flag, and you can see it's both of the values from the routine and the collocated where they were greater than 10% apart. Those are both flagged. And we could take a look at the logbook, for example, to see if anything was weird about one of them, but we don't necessarily have to invalidate both of them. And then these are these values that were greater than 10, flagged with an R, just because we put in 0 to 10 in that range, so that's what R stands for. So we're going to click the lower X, and now we're going to transfer from the verification table to the archive table. Yes, 12 rows, yes. Now let's look at the data archive table. Okay, so now the lab data goes into its own archive table, and the sampler data goes into its own archive table. So we have here 12 rows of lab data, our first set of data in our PM2.5 filter program is in our archive table. Now we have to make sure to clear out the pipeline, so we're going to clear the data verification table, and that just empties it, so getting rid of the rows. And now the final step, do we have any more data we want to import? If we had a different file, we could click this. We don't, so we're going to close the forms and clear the data import table. That way when we do the import of the next set of data, the pipeline will be empty and ready to do the import. So click that. This will delete the data import table. Yes, we are done, and we are finished with this exercise, except for getting out of the toolbox, finding it in your folder, right-clicking it, making a copy, and pasting it into your backups folder, and then getting a copy of the toolbox to your instructor.